This is Chapter 20, The New Era, from the second edition of the American Yawp, Volume 2, by the Stanford University Press. This audiobook was produced by Audileo.com, a leader in academic audiobooks. 1. Introduction. On a sunny day in early March 1921, Warren G. Harding took the oath of office to become the 29th President of the United States. He had won a landslide election by promising a return to normalcy. "Our supreme task is the resumption of our onward, normal way," he declared in his inaugural address. While campaigning, he said, "America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration." The nation still reeled from the shock of World War I, the explosion of racial violence and political repression in 1919, and the lingering Red Scare sparked by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. More than 115,000 American soldiers had lost their lives in barely a year of fighting in Europe. Then, between 1918 and 1920, nearly 700,000 Americans died in a flu epidemic that hit nearly 20% of the American population. Waves of labor strikes, meanwhile, hit soon after the war. Radicals bellowed. Anarchists and others sent more than 30 bombs through the mail on May 1, 1919. After wartime controls fell, the economy tanked and national unemployment hit 20%. Farmers' bankruptcy rates, already egregious, now skyrocketed. Harding could hardly deliver the peace that he promised, but his message nevertheless resonated among a populace racked by instability. The 1920s, of course, would be anything but normal. The decade so reshaped American life that it came to be called by many names: the New Era, the Jazz Age, the Age of the Flapper, the Prosperity Decade, and most commonly, the Roaring Twenties. The mass production and consumption of automobiles, household appliances, and film and radio programs fueled a new economy and new standards of living. New mass entertainment introduced talking films and jazz music, while sexual and social restraints loosened. As Americans fought harder than ever for equal rights, cultural observers noted the appearance of the new woman and the new Negro. At the same time, however, many Americans turned their back on political and economic reform, denounced America's shifting demographics, stifled immigration, retreated toward old-time religion, and revived the Ku Klux Klan with millions of new members. Old immigrant communities that had predated new immigration quotas, meanwhile, clung to their cultures and their native faiths in the face of Americanization. The 1920s were a decade of conflict and tension. But whatever it was not normalcy. 2. Republican White House, 1921 to 1933. To deliver on his promises of stability and prosperity, Harding signed legislation to restore a high protective tariff and dismantled the last wartime controls over industry. Meanwhile, the vestiges of America's involvement in World War I and its propaganda and suspicions of anything less than 100% American pushed Congress to address fears of immigration and foreign populations. The sour post-war economy led elites to raise the specter of the Russian Revolution and sideline not just the various American socialist and anarchist organizations, but nearly all union activism. During the 1920s, the labor movement suffered sharp declines in membership. Workers lost not only bargaining power, but also the support of courts, politicians, and, in large measure, the American public. Harding's presidency would go down in history as among the most corrupt. Many of Harding's cabinet appointees, however, were individuals of some stature, who answered to various American constituencies. For instance, Henry C. Wallace, the vocal editor of Wallace's Farmer and a well-known proponent of scientific farming, was made Secretary of Agriculture. Herbert Hoover, the popular head and administrator of the Wartime Food Administration and a self-made millionaire, was made Secretary of Commerce. To satisfy business interests, the conservative businessman Andrew Mellon became Secretary of the Treasury. Mostly, however, it was the appointing of friends and close supporters, dubbed the Ohio Gang, that led to trouble. Harding's administration suffered a tremendous setback when several officials conspired to lease government land in Wyoming to oil companies in exchange for cash. In what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, named after a nearby rock formation that resembled a teapot, Interior Secretary Albert Fall and Navy Secretary Edwin Denby resigned, and Fall was convicted and sent to jail. Harding took vacation in the summer of 1923 so that he could think deeply on how to deal with my goddamned friends. It was his friends, not his enemies, who kept him up walking the halls at nights. But then, in August 1923, Harding died suddenly of a heart attack, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge ascended to the highest office in the land. The son of a shopkeeper, Coolidge climbed the Republican ranks from city councilman to governor of Massachusetts. As president, Coolidge sought to remove the stain of scandal, but otherwise continued Harding's economic approach, refusing to take actions in defense of workers or consumers against American business. The chief business of the American people, the new president stated, is business. One observer called Coolidge's policy active inactivity, but Coolidge was not afraid of supporting business interests and wealthy Americans by lowering taxes or maintaining high tariff rates. Congress, for instance, had already begun to reduce taxes on the wealthy from wartime levels of 66% to 20%, which Coolidge championed. While Coolidge supported business, other Americans agitated for social causes. The 1920s, for instance, represented a time of great activism among American women, who had won the vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Female voters, like their male counterparts, pursued many interests. Concerned about squalor, poverty, and domestic violence, women had already lent their efforts to Prohibition, which went into effect under the 18th Amendment in January 1920. After that point, alcohol could no longer be manufactured or sold. Other reformers urged government action to ameliorate high mortality rates among infants and children, provide federal aid for education, and ensure peace and disarmament. Some activists advocated protective legislation for women and children, while Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party called for the elimination of all legal distinctions on account of sex through the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, which was introduced but defeated in Congress. National politics in the 1920s was dominated by the Republican Party, which held not only the presidency, but both houses of Congress as well. Coolidge decided not to seek a second term in 1928. A man of few words, Silent Cal, publicized his decision by handing a scrap of paper to a reporter that read simply, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That year's race became a contest between the Democratic governor of New York, Al Smith, whose Catholic faith and immigrant background aroused nativist suspicions, and whose connections to Tammany Hall and anti-prohibition politics offended reformers, and the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, whose all-American, Midwestern Protestant background and managerial prowess during World War I endeared him to American voters. Hoover focused on economic growth and prosperity. He had served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, and claimed credit for the sustained growth seen during the 1920s. "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land," he said when he launched his 1928 presidential campaign. "Given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." Despite Hoover's claims, which would come to seem farcical after the onset of the Great Depression, much of the election centered on Smith's religion and his opposition to Prohibition. Many Protestant ministers preached against Smith and warned that he would be enthralled to the Pope. Hoover won in a landslide, while Smith won handily in the nation's largest cities, portending future political trends. He lost most of the rest of the country. Even several solidly Democratic Southern states pulled the lever for a Republican for the first time since Reconstruction. 3. Culture of consumption. Change is in the very air Americans breathe, and consumer changes are the very bricks out of which we are building our new kind of civilization, announced marketing expert and home economist Christine Frederick in her influential 1929 monograph Selling Mrs. Consumer. The book, which was based on one of the earliest surveys of American buying habits, advised manufacturers and advertisers how to capture the purchasing power of women, who, according to Frederick, accounted for 90% of household expenditures. Aside from granting advertisers insight into the psychology of the average consumer, Frederick's text captured the tremendous social and economic transformations that had been wrought over the course of her lifetime. Indeed, the America of Frederick's birth looked very different from the one she confronted in 1929. The consumer change she studied had resulted from the industrial expansion of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With the discovery of new energy sources and manufacturing technologies, industrial output flooded the market with a range of consumer products such as ready-to-wear clothing, convenience foods, and home appliances. By the end of the 19th century, output had risen so dramatically that many contemporaries feared supply had outpaced demand and that the nation would soon face the devastating financial consequences of overproduction. American businessmen attempted to avoid this catastrophe by developing new merchandising and marketing strategies that transformed distribution and stimulated a new culture of consumer desire. The department store stood at the center of this early consumer revolution. By the 1880s, several large dry goods houses blossomed into modern retail department stores. These emporiums concentrated a broad array of goods under a single roof, allowing customers to purchase shirtwaists and gloves alongside toy trains and wash basins. To attract customers, department stores relied on more than variety. They also employed innovations in service, such as access to restaurants, writing rooms, and babysitting, and spectacle, such as elaborately decorated store windows, fashion shows, and interior merchandise displays. Marshall Field was among the most successful of these entrepreneurs. Located on State Street in Chicago, his store, Marshall Field & Company, pioneered many of these strategies, including establishing a tea room that provided refreshment to the well-heeled female shoppers who composed the store's clientele. Reflecting on the success of Field's marketing techniques, Thomas W. Goodspeed, an early trustee of the University of Chicago, wrote, "Perhaps the most notable of Mr. Field's innovations was that he made a store in which it was a joy to buy." The joy of buying infected a growing number of Americans in the early 20th century, as the rise of mail-order catalogs, mass circulation magazines, and national branding further stoked consumer desire. The automobile industry also fostered the new culture of consumption by promoting the use of credit. By 1927, more than 60% of American automobiles were sold on credit, and installment purchasing was made available for nearly every other large consumer purchase. Spurred by access to easy credit, consumer expenditures for household appliances, for example, grew by more than 120% between 1919 and 1929. Henry Ford's assembly line, which advanced production strategies taken up by countless industries, brought automobiles within the reach of middle-income Americans and further drove the spirit of consumerism. By 1925, Ford's factories were turning out a Model T every 10 seconds. The number of registered cars ballooned from just over 9 million in 1920 to nearly 27 million by the decade's end. Americans owned more cars than Great Britain, Germany, France, and Italy combined. In the late 1920s, 80% of the world's cars drove on American roads. 4. Culture of escape. As transformative as steam and iron had been in the previous century, gasoline and electricity, embodied most dramatically for many Americans in automobiles, movies, and radio programs, propelled not only consumption, but also the famed popular culture of the 1920s. "We wish to escape," wrote Edgar Burroughs, author of the Tarzan series, "the restrictions of man-made laws and the inhibitions that society has placed upon us." Burroughs authored a new Tarzan story nearly every year from 1914 until 1939. "We would each like to be Tarzan," he said. "At least I would, I admit it." Like many Americans in the 1920s, Burroughs sought to challenge and escape the constraints of a society that seemed more industrialized with each passing day. Just like Burroughs, Americans escaped with great speed. Whether through the automobile, Hollywood's latest films, jazz records produced on Tin Pan Alley, or the hours spent listening to radio broadcasts of Jack Dempsey's prize fights, the public wrapped itself in popular culture. One observer estimated that Americans belted out the silly musical hit, "Yes, We Have No Bananas," more than the Star-Spangled Banner, and all the hymns and all the hymnals combined. As the automobile became more popular and more reliable, more people traveled more frequently and attempted greater distances. Women increasingly drove themselves to their own activities as well as those of their children. Vacationing Americans sped to Florida to escape northern winters. Young men and women fled the supervision of courtship, exchanging the staid parlor couch for sexual exploration in the back seat of a sedan. In order to serve and capture the growing number of drivers, Americans erected gas stations, diners, motels, and billboards along the roadside. Automobiles themselves became objects of entertainment. Nearly 100,000 people gathered to watch drivers compete for the $50,000 prize of the Indianapolis 500. Meanwhile, the United States dominated the global film industry. By 1930, as movie-making became more expensive, a handful of film companies had seized control of the industry. It was left to immigrants, mostly of Jewish heritage from Central and Eastern Europe, to invent Hollywood, because most turn-of-the-century middle and upper-class Americans disdained cinema as lower-class entertainment. After their parents emigrated from Poland in 1876, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack Warner, who were, according to family lore, given the name when an Ellis Island official could not understand their surname, founded Warner Brothers. In 1918, Universal, Paramount, Columbia, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer (MGM) were all founded by or led by Jewish executives. Aware of their social status as outsiders, these immigrants, or sons of immigrants, purposefully produced films that portrayed American values of opportunity, democracy, and freedom. Not content with distributing 30-minute films, accessible in small establishments known as Nickelodeons, film moguls produced longer, higher-quality films and showed them in palatial theaters that attracted those who had previously shunned the film industry. But as filmmakers captured the middle and upper classes, they held on to working-class moviegoers by blending traditional and modern values. Cecil B. DeMille's 1923 epic, The Ten Commandments, depicted orgiastic revelry, for instance, while still managing to celebrate a biblical story. But what good was a silver screen in a dingy theater? Moguls and entrepreneurs soon constructed picture palaces. Samuel Rothaffel's Roxy Theater in New York held more than 6,000 patrons, to be escorted by a uniformed usher past gardens and statues to their cushioned seat. In order to show The Jazz Singer, 1927, the first movie with synchronized vocal track and pictures, the Warners spent $500,000 to equip 2 theaters. "Sound is a passing fancy," one MGM producer told his wife, but Warner Brothers' assets, which increased from just $5 million in 1925 to $230 million in 1930, told a different story. Americans fell in love with the movies. Whether it was the surroundings, the sound, or the production budgets, weekly movie attendance skyrocketed from 16 million in 1912 to 40 million in the early 1920s. Hungarian immigrant William Fox, founder of Fox Film Corporation, declared that the motion picture is a distinctly American institution because the rich rub elbows with the poor in movie theaters. With no seating restriction, the one-price admission was accessible for nearly all Americans. African Americans, however, were either excluded or segregated. Women represented more than 60% of moviegoers, packing theaters to see Mary Pickford, nicknamed America's Sweetheart, who was earning $1 million a year by 1920 through a combination of film and endorsement contracts. Pickford and other female stars popularized the flapper, a woman who favored short skirts, makeup, and cigarettes. As Americans went to the movies more and more, at home they had the radio. Italian scientist Guglielmo Marconi transmitted the first transatlantic wireless radio message in 1901, but radios in the home did not become available until around 1920, when they boomed across the country. Around half of American homes contained a radio by 1930. Radio stations brought entertainment directly into the living room, through the sale of advertisements and sponsorships. from the Maxwell House Hour to B.A. Rolfe and his Lucky Strike Orchestra. Soap companies sponsored daytime dramas so frequently that an entire genre, soap operas, was born, providing housewives with audio adventures that stood in stark contrast to common chores. Though radio stations were often under the control of corporations like the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, or the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, radio programs were less constrained by traditional boundaries in order to capture as wide an audience as possible, spreading popular culture on a national level. Radio exposed Americans to a broad array of music. Jazz, a uniquely American musical style popularized by the African American community in New Orleans, spread primarily through radio stations and records. The New York Times had ridiculed jazz as savage because of its racial heritage, but the music represented cultural independence to others. As Harlem-based musician William Dixon put it, "It did seem to a little boy that white people really owned everything." But that wasn't entirely true. They didn't own the music that I played. The fast-paced and spontaneity-laced tunes invited the listener to dance along. When a good orchestra plays a rag, dance instructor Vernon Castle recalled, one has simply got to move. Jazz became a national sensation, played and heard by both white and black Americans. Jewish Lithuanian-born singer Al Jolson, whose biography inspired the jazz singer, and who played the film's titular character, became the most popular singer in America. The 1920s also witnessed the maturation of professional sports. Play-by-play radio broadcasts of major collegiate and professional sporting events marked a new era for sports, despite the institutionalization of racial segregation in most. Suddenly, Jack Dempsey's left crosses and right uppercuts could almost be felt in homes across the United States. Dempsey, who held the heavyweight championship for most of the decade, drew million-dollar gates and inaugurated Dempsey Mania in newspapers across the country. Harold Edward "Red" Grange, who carried the football with a similar recklessness, helped popularize professional football, which was then in the shadow of the college game. Grange left the University of Illinois before graduating to join the Chicago Bears in 1925. There had never been such evidence of public interest since our professional league began, recalled Bears owner George Hollis of Grange's arrival. Perhaps no sports figure left a bigger mark than did Babe Ruth. Born George Herman Ruth, the Sultan of Swat, grew up in an orphanage in Baltimore's slums. Ruth's emergence on the national scene was much needed, as the baseball world had been rocked by the so-called Black Sox scandal, in which 8 Chicago White Sox players allegedly agreed to throw the 1919 World Series. Ruth hit 54 home runs in 1920, which was more than any other American League team. Baseball writers called Ruth a Superman, and more Americans could recognize Ruth than they could then-President Warren G. Harding. After an era of destruction and doubt brought about by World War I, Americans craved heroes who seemed to defy convention and break boundaries. Dempsey, Grange, and Ruth dominated their respective sports, but only Charles Lindbergh conquered the sky. On May 21, 1927, Lindbergh concluded the first-ever non-stop solo flight from New York to Paris. Armed with only a few sandwiches, some bottles of water, paper maps, and a flashlight, Lindbergh successfully navigated over the Atlantic Ocean in 33 hours. Some historians have dubbed Lindbergh the hero of the decade, not only for his transatlantic journey, but because he helped to restore the faith of many Americans in individual effort and technological advancement. In a world so recently devastated by machine guns, submarines, and chemical weapons, Lindbergh's flight demonstrated that technology could inspire and accomplish great things. Outlook magazine called Lindbergh the heir of all that we like to think is best in America. The decade's popular culture seemed to revolve around escape. Coney Island in New York marked new amusements for young and old. Americans drove their sedans to massive theaters to enjoy major motion pictures. Radio towers broadcast the bold new sound of jazz, the adventures of soap operas, and the feats of amazing athletes. Dempsey and Grange seemed bigger, stronger, and faster than any who dared to challenge them. Babe Ruth smashed home runs out of ballparks. And Lindbergh escaped the Earth's gravity and crossed an entire ocean. Neither Dempsey nor Ruth nor Lindbergh made Americans forget the horrors of World War I and the chaos that followed, but they made it seem as if the future might be brighter. 5. The New Woman. The rising emphasis on spending and accumulation nurtured a national ethos of materialism and individual pleasure. These impulses were embodied in the figure of the flapper, whose bobbed hair, short skirts, makeup, cigarettes, and carefree spirit captured the attention of American novelists such as F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis. Rejecting the old Victorian values of desexualized modesty and self-restraint, young flappers seized opportunities for the public co-ed pleasures offered by new commercial leisure institutions, such as dance halls, cabarets, and Nickelodeons, not to mention the illicit blind tigers and speakeasies, venues where alcohol could be consumed, spawned by Prohibition. In so doing, young American women had helped usher in a new morality that permitted women greater independence, freedom of movement, and access to the delights of urban living. In the words of psychologist G. Stanley Hall, she was out to see the world and, incidentally, be seen of it. Such sentiments were repeated in an oft-cited advertisement in a 1930 edition of the Chicago Daily Tribune. Today's woman gets what she wants. The vote. Slim sheaths of silk to replace voluminous petticoats. Glassware in sapphire blue or glowing amber. The right to a career. Soap to match her bathroom's color scheme. As with so much else in the 1920s, however, sex and gender were in many ways a study in contradictions. It was the decade of the new woman, and one in which only 10% of married women, although nearly half of unmarried women, worked outside the home. It was a decade in which new technologies decreased time requirements for household chores, and one in which standards of cleanliness and order in the home rose to often impossible standards. It was a decade in which women finally could exercise their right to vote, and one in which the often thinly bound women's coalitions that had secured that victory splintered into various causes. Finally, it was a decade in which images, such as the flapper, gave women new modes of representing femininity, and one in which such representations were often inaccessible to women of certain races, ages, and socioeconomic classes. Women undoubtedly gained much in the 1920s. There was a profound and keenly felt cultural shift that, for many women, meant increased opportunity to work outside the home. The number of professional women, for example, significantly rose in the decade. But limits still existed, even for professional women. Occupations such as law and medicine remained overwhelmingly male. Most female professionals were in feminized professions such as teaching and nursing. And even within these fields, it was difficult for women to rise to leadership positions. Further, it is crucial not to overgeneralize the experience of all women based on the experiences of a much commented upon subset of the population. A woman's race, class, ethnicity, and marital status all had an impact on both the likelihood that she worked outside the home and the types of opportunities that were available to her. While there were exceptions, for many minority women, work outside the home was not a cultural statement but rather a financial necessity, or both, and physically demanding, low-paying domestic service work continued to be the most common job type. Young working-class white women were joining the workforce more frequently too, but often in order to help support their struggling mothers and fathers. For young middle-class white women, those most likely to fit the image of the carefree flapper, the most common workplace was the office. These predominantly single women increasingly became clerks, jobs that had been primarily male in earlier years. But here too, there was a clear ceiling. While entry-level clerk jobs became increasingly feminized, jobs at higher, more lucrative levels remained dominated by men. Further, rather than changing the culture of the workplace, the entrance of women into lower-level jobs primarily changed the coding of the jobs themselves. Such positions simply became women's work. Finally, as these same women grew older and married, the social changes became even subtler. Married women were, for the most part, expected to remain in the domestic sphere. And while new patterns of consumption gave them more power and, arguably, more autonomy, new household technologies and philosophies of marriage and child rearing increased expectations, further tying these women to the home, a paradox that becomes clear in advertisements such as the one in the Chicago Daily Tribune. Of course, the number of women in the workplace cannot exclusively measure changes in sex and gender norms. Attitudes towards sex, for example, liberalized in the 1920s as well. Not all Americans embraced new ideas about sexuality during the 1920s, but for many women, particularly young college-educated white women, an attempt to rebel against what they saw as a repressive Victorian notion of sexuality led to an increase in premarital sexual activity strong enough that it became, in the words of one historian, almost a matter of conformity. Meanwhile, especially in urban centers such as New York, the gay community flourished. While gay males had to contend with the increased policing of their daily lives, especially later in the decade, they generally lived more openly in such cities than they would be able to for many decades following World War II. At the same time, for many lesbians in the decade, the increased sexualization of women brought new scrutiny to same-sex female relationships previously dismissed as harmless. Ultimately, the most enduring symbol of the changing notions of gender in the 1920s remains the flapper. And indeed, that image was a new, available representation of womanhood in the 1920s. But it is just that, a representation of womanhood of the 1920s. There were many women in the decade of differing races, classes, ethnicities, and experiences, just as there were many men with different experiences. For some women, the 1920s were a time of reorganization, new representations, and new opportunities. For others, it was a decade of confusion, contradiction, new pressures, and struggles new and old. 6. The New Negro. The iniquities of Jim Crow segregation, the barbarities of America's lynching epidemic, and the depravities of 1919's Red Summer weighed heavily upon Black Americans as they entered the 1920s. The injustices and the violence continued. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Americans had built up the Greenwood District with commerce and prosperity. Booker T. Washington called it the Black Wall Street. On the evening of May 31, 1921, spurred by a false claim of sexual assault levied against a young black man, 19-year-old Dick Rowland had likely either tripped over a young white elevator operator's foot or tripped and brushed the woman's shoulder with his hand. A white mob mobilized, armed themselves, and destroyed the prosperous neighborhood. Over 30 square blocks were destroyed. Mobs burned over 1,000 homes and killed as many as several hundred Black Tulsans. Survivors recalled the mob using heavy machine guns, and others reported planes circling overhead, firing rifles and dropping firebombs. When order was finally restored the next day, the bodies of the victims were buried in mass graves. Thousands of survivors were left homeless. The relentlessness of racial violence awoke a generation of Black Americans to new alternatives. The Great Migration had pulled enormous numbers of Black Southerners northward, and just as cultural limits loosened across the nation, the 1920s represented a period of self-reflection among African Americans, especially those in northern cities. New York City was a popular destination of Black Americans during the Great Migration. The city's Black population grew 257%, from 91,709 in 1910 to 327,706 by 1930. The white population grew only 20%. Moreover, by 1930, some 98,620 foreign-born Black people had migrated to the United States. Nearly half made their home in Manhattan's Harlem district. Harlem originally lay between 5th Avenue and 8th Avenue and 130th Street to 145th Street. By 1930, the district had expanded to 155th Street and was home to 164,000 people, mostly African Americans. Continuous relocation to the greatest Negro city in the world exacerbated problems with crime, health, housing, and unemployment. Nevertheless, it brought together a mass of Black people energized by race pride, military service in World War I, the urban environment, and for many, ideas of Pan-Africanism or Garveyism, discussed shortly. James Weldon Johnson called Harlem the culture capital. The area's cultural ferment produced the Harlem Renaissance and fostered what was then termed the New Negro movement. Alain Locke did not coin the term New Negro, but he did much to popularize it. In the 1925 book The New Negro, Locke proclaimed that the generation of subservience was no more. We are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation. Bringing together writings by men and women, young and old, black and white, Locke produced an anthology that was of African Americans, rather than only about them. The book joined many others. Popular Harlem Renaissance writers published some 26 novels, 10 volumes of poetry, and countless short stories between 1922 and 1935. Alongside the well-known Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, female writers like Jessie Redmond Fawcett and Zora Neale Hurston published nearly one-third of these novels. While the themes varied, the literature frequently explored and countered pervading stereotypes and forms of American racial prejudice. The Harlem Renaissance was manifested in theater, art, and music. For the first time, Broadway presented black actors in serious roles. The 1924 production Dixie to Broadway was the first all-black show with mainstream showings. In art, Meta Vo Warwick Fuller, Aaron Douglas, and Palmer Hayden showcased black cultural heritage and captured the population's current experience. In music, jazz rocketed in popularity. Eager to hear real jazz, whites journeyed to Harlem's Cotton Club and Small's Paradise. Next to Greenwich Village, Harlem's nightclubs and speakeasies presented a place where sexual freedom and gay life thrived. Unfortunately, while headliners like Duke Ellington were hired to entertain at Harlem's venues, the surrounding black community was usually excluded. Furthermore, black performers were often restricted from restroom use and relegated to service door entry. As the Harlem Renaissance faded to a close, several of its artists went on to produce important works, indicating that this movement was but one component in African Americans' long history of cultural and intellectual achievements. The explosion of African American self-expression found multiple outlets in politics. In the 1910s and 1920s, perhaps no one so attracted disaffected black activists as Marcus Garvey. Garvey was a Jamaican publisher and labor organizer who arrived in New York City in 1916. Within just a few years of his arrival, he had built the largest black nationalist organization in the world, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Inspired by Pan-Africanism and Booker T. Washington's model of industrial education, and critical of what he saw as Du Bois' elitist strategies in service of black elites, Garvey sought to promote racial pride, encourage black economic independence, and root out racial oppression in Africa and the diaspora. Headquartered in Harlem, the UNIA published a newspaper, Negro World, and organized elaborate parades in which members, known as Garveyites, dressed in ornate militaristic regalia and marched down city streets. The organization criticized the slow pace of the judicial focus of the NAACP, as well as its acceptance of memberships and funds from whites. For the Negro to depend on the ballot and his industrial progress alone, Garvey opined, will be hopeless, as it does not help him when he is lynched, burned, Jim Crowed, and segregated. In 1919, the UNIA announced plans to develop a shipping company called the Black Star Line as part of a plan that pushed for black Americans to reject the political system and to return to Africa instead. Most of the investments came in the form of shares purchased by UNIA members, many of whom heard Garvey give rousing speeches across the country about the importance of establishing commercial ventures between African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Africans. Garvey's detractors disparaged these public displays and poorly managed business ventures, and they criticized Garvey for peddling empty gestures in place of measures that addressed the material concerns of African Americans. NAACP leaders depicted Garvey's plan as one that simply said, "Give up. Surrender. The struggle is useless." Inflamed by his aggressive attacks on other black activists and his radical ideas of racial independence, many African American and Afro-Caribbean leaders worked with government officials and launched the Garvey Must Go campaign, which culminated in his 1922 indictment and 1925 imprisonment and subsequent deportation for using the mails for fraudulent purposes. The UNIA never recovered its popularity or financial support, but Garvey's movement made a lasting impact on Black consciousness in the United States and abroad. He inspired the likes of Malcolm X, whose parents were Garveyites, and Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Garvey's message, perhaps best captured by his rallying cry, "Up, you mighty race," resonated with African Americans who found in Garveyism a dignity not granted them in their everyday lives. In that sense, it was all too typical of the Harlem Renaissance. 7. Culture War. For all of its cultural ferment, however, the 1920s were also a difficult time for radicals and immigrants and anything modern. Fear of foreign radicals led to the executions of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists, in 1927. In May 1920, the two had been arrested for robbery and murder connected with an incident at a Massachusetts factory. Their guilty verdicts were appealed for years, as the evidence surrounding their convictions was slim. For instance, while one eyewitness claimed that Vanzetti drove the getaway car, accounts of others described a different person altogether. Nevertheless, despite worldwide lobbying by radicals and a respectable movement among middle-class Italian organizations in the United States, the two men were executed on August 23, 1927. Vanzetti conceivably provided the most succinct reason for his death, saying, "I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian." The Sacco and Vanzetti trial exacerbated a rampant American nativism. Already flustered by a radically liberalizing culture, many native-born Americans made scapegoats out of Eastern European and Latin American immigrants. Asian immigration had already been almost completely prohibited, as well as those Black Americans now pushing harder for civil rights. This latter trend was magnified by the effects of the Great Migration, the mass exodus that carried nearly 500,000 Black Southerners out of the South and to northern cities after 1910. Protestants, meanwhile, continued to denounce the Roman Catholic Church and charged that American Catholics gave their allegiance to the Pope and not to their country. Nativist anxiety spurred the 1921 Emergency Immigration Act, the first American immigration law to apply numerical limits and blanket broad-scale national origin restrictions across much of the globe. An immigration regime predicated mostly on selective restrictions suddenly embraced large-scale comprehensive restrictions. As one legal historian put it, the law shattered the basic inclusive premise of U.S. immigration policy. The presumption that most persons could immigrate to the United States gave way to the presumption that most persons could not. Intended as a stopgap, its restrictive quota-based system was made permanent, with even more aggressive racial engineering of the quota system, by the Immigration Act of 1924, also called the Johnson-Reed Act after its congressional sponsors. The Johnson-Reed Act capped overall immigration levels and fixed the number of immigrants annually admitted to the United States from each nation at 2% of the population from the respective country who had resided in the United States in 1890. By pushing back 3 decades, past the recent waves of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia, the law made it extremely difficult, almost impossible, for immigrants outside Northern Europe to legally enter the United States. Later adjustments to the quota calculations preserved those geographic inequalities. The act also explicitly excluded all Asians, although to satisfy Southern and Western growers, it omitted restrictions on Mexican immigrants, despite the efforts of nativist congressmen such as John Box, who fought to impose a quota on Mexican immigrants throughout the rest of the 1920s. Increasing visa restrictions ultimately made citizenship increasingly difficult regardless. The exclusions and harsh quotas, and in the case of Mexico, the effort to impose harsh quotas, sparked diplomatic fury as affected nations protested such insults. At home, the law remade American demographics. Second and third generation Americans increasingly overshadowed foreign-born immigrants in American immigrant communities. At the same time, the act functionally created, or breathed life into, the very concept of an illegal alien, aside most notably from the Chinese Exclusion Act, American immigration law had not targeted entire nationalities. Policing followed legislation. 3 days after Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, it appropriated $1 million for the creation of the U.S. Border Patrol, whose agents began policing the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada borders. The United States, a nation of immigrants, had shut its doors. The same year, Congress mandated birthright citizenship for those with the longest historical claim to the land. The American Indian Citizenship Act proclaimed that all Native Americans are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. Prior to the 1924 Act, a haphazard naturalization process rendered some Native Americans citizens and others as wards of the federal government, dependent upon the whims of a legal federal guardianship system. The act did not immediately lead to total self-determination or curb abusive federal mismanagement, but it provided a foundation for individual legal protections and collective civil rights. For others, however, the act was an imposition that contradicted the sovereign status of native nationhood and membership within it. 8. Fundamentalist Christianity. In addition to alarms over immigration and the growing presence of Catholicism and Judaism, a new core of Christian fundamentalists was very much concerned about relaxed sexual mores and increased social freedoms, especially as found in city centers. Although never a centralized group, most fundamentalists lashed out against what they saw as a sagging public morality, a world in which Protestantism seemed challenged by Catholicism, women exercised ever greater sexual freedoms, public amusements encouraged selfish and empty pleasures, and critics mocked prohibition through bootlegging and speakeasies. Christian fundamentalism arose most directly from a doctrinal dispute among Protestant leaders. Liberal theologians sought to intertwine religion with science and secular culture. These modernists, influenced by the biblical scholarship of 19th-century German academics, argued that Christian doctrines about the miraculous might be best understood metaphorically. The Church, they said, needed to adapt itself to the world. According to the Baptist pastor Harry Emerson Fosdick, the coming of Christ might occur slowly, but surely, as his will and principles are worked out by God's grace in human life and institutions. The social gospel, which encouraged Christians to build the kingdom of God on earth by working against social and economic inequality, was very much tied to liberal theology. During the 1910s, funding from oil barons Lyman and Milton Stewart enabled the evangelist A.C. Dixon to commission some 90 essays to combat religious liberalism. The collection, known as the Fundamentals, became the foundational documents of Christian fundamentalism, from which the movement's name is drawn. Contributors agreed that Christian faith rested on literal truths, that Jesus, for instance, would physically return to earth at the end of time to redeem the righteous and damn the wicked. Some of the essays put forth that human endeavor would not build the kingdom of God, while others covered such subjects as the virgin birth and biblical inerrancy. American fundamentalists spanned Protestant denominations and borrowed from diverse philosophies and theologies, most notably the Holiness Movement, the larger revivalism of the 19th century, and New Dispensationalist theology, in which history proceeded and would end through dispensations by God. They did, however, all agree that modernism was the enemy and the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. It was a fluid movement often without clear boundaries, but it featured many prominent clergymen, including the well-established and extremely vocal John Roach Stratton, New York, J. Frank Norris, Texas, and William Bell Riley, Minnesota. On March 21, 1925, in a tiny courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee, fundamentalists gathered to tackle the issues of creation and evolution. A young biology teacher, John T. Scopes, was being tried for teaching his students evolutionary theory in violation of the Butler Act, a state law preventing evolutionary theory or any theory that denied the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible from being taught in publicly funded Tennessee classrooms. Seeing the act as a threat to personal liberty, the ACLU immediately sought a volunteer for a test case, hoping that the conviction and subsequent appeals would lead to a day in the Supreme Court testing the constitutionality of the law. It was then that Scopes, a part-time teacher and coach, stepped up and voluntarily admitted to teaching evolution. Scopes's violation of the law was never in question. Thus the stage was set for the pivotal courtroom showdown, the trial of the century, between the champions and opponents of evolution that marked a key moment in an enduring American culture war. The case became a public spectacle. Clarence Darrow, an agnostic attorney and a keen liberal mind from Chicago, volunteered to aid the defense and came up against William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, the great commoner, was the three-time presidential candidate who in his younger days had led the political crusade against corporate greed. He had done so with a firm belief in the righteousness of his cause, and now he defended biblical literalism in similar terms. The theory of evolution, Bryan said, with its emphasis on the survival of the fittest, would eliminate love and carry man back to a struggle of tooth and claw. Newspapermen and spectators flooded the small town of Dayton. Across the nation, Americans tuned their radios to the national broadcasts of a trial that dealt with questions of religious liberty, academic freedom, parental rights, and the moral responsibility of education. For 6 days in July, the men and women of America were captivated as Bryan presented his argument on the morally corrupting influence of evolutionary theory, and pointed out that Darrow made a similar argument about the corruptive potential of education during his defense of the famed killers Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb a year before. Darrow eloquently fought for academic freedom. At the request of the defense, Bryan took the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. At his age, he was no match for Darrow's famous skills as a trial lawyer, and his answers came across as blundering and incoherent, particularly as he was not in fact a literal believer in all of the Genesis account, believing, as many anti-evolutionists did, that the meaning of the word day in the book of Genesis could be taken as allegory, and only hesitantly admitted as much, not wishing to alienate his fundamentalist followers. Additionally, Darrow posed a series of unanswerable questions. Was the great fish that swallowed the prophet Jonah created for that specific purpose? What precisely happened astronomically when God made the sun stand still? Bryan, of course, could cite only his faith in miracles. Tied into logical contradictions, Bryan's testimony was a public relations disaster. Although his statements were expunged from the record the next day, and no further experts were allowed, Scopes's guilt being established, the jury delivered a guilty verdict in minutes. The case was later thrown out on a technicality. But few cared about the verdict. Darrow had, in many ways, at least to his defenders, already won. The fundamentalists seemed to have taken a beating in the national limelight. Journalist and satirist H.L. Mencken characterized the circus in Tennessee as an embarrassment for fundamentalism, and modernists remembered the monkey trial as a smashing victory. If fundamentalists retreated from the public sphere, they did not disappear entirely. Instead, they went local, built a vibrant subculture, and emerged many decades later stronger than ever. 9. Rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Suspicions of immigrants, Catholics, and modernists contributed to a string of reactionary organizations. None so captured the imaginations of the country as the reborn Ku Klux Klan, KKK, a white supremacist organization that expanded beyond its narrow Reconstruction-era anti-black politics to target not just black people but feminists, radicals, immigrants, Catholics, Jews, atheists, bootleggers, and a host of other imagined moral enemies. Two events in 1915 are widely credited with inspiring the rebirth of the Klan: the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish factory worker in Georgia falsely convicted of murdering a teenage girl, and the release of The Birth of a Nation, a popular and groundbreaking film that valorized the Reconstruction-era Klan as a protector of feminine virtue and white racial purity. Taking advantage of this sudden surge of popularity, Colonel William Joseph Simmons organized what is often called the Second Ku Klux Klan in Georgia in late 1915. This new Klan, modeled after other fraternal organizations with elaborate rituals and a hierarchy, remained largely confined to Georgia and Alabama until 1920, when Simmons began a professional recruiting effort that resulted in individual chapters being formed across the country and membership rising into the millions. Partly in response to the migration of black Southerners to northern cities during World War I, the KKK expanded above the Mason-Dixon line. Membership soared in Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, and Portland, while Klan-endorsed mayoral candidates won in Indianapolis, Denver, and Atlanta. The Klan, often recruited through fraternal organizations such as the Freemasons and through various Protestant churches. In many areas, local Klansmen visited churches of which they approved and bestowed a gift of money on the presiding minister, often during the services. The Klan also enticed people to join through large picnics, parades, rallies, and ceremonies. The Klan established a women's auxiliary in 1923, headquartered in Little Rock, Arkansas. The women of the Ku Klux Klan mirrored the KKK in practice and ideology, and soon had chapters in all 48 states, often attracting women who were already part of the Prohibition movement, the defense of which was a centerpiece of Klan activism. Contrary to its perception of as a primarily Southern and lower-class phenomenon, the Second Klan had a national reach composed largely of middle-class people. Many years later, sociologist Rory McVeigh surveyed the Imperial Nighthawk, the main KKK newspaper, for the years 1923 and 1924, at the organization's peak, and found the largest number of Klan-related activities to have occurred in Texas, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and Georgia. The Klan was even present in Canada, where it was a powerful force within Saskatchewan's Conservative Party. In many states and localities, the Klan dominated politics to such a level that one could not be elected without the support of the KKK. For example, in 1924, the Klan supported William Lee Kazort for governor of Arkansas, leading his opponent in the Democratic Party primary, Thomas Terrell, to seek honorary membership through a Louisiana clavern so as not to be tagged as the anti-Klan candidate. In 1922, Texans elected Earl B. Mayfield, an avowed Klansman who ran openly as that year's candidate to the U.S. Senate. At its peak, the Klan claimed between 4 and 5 million members. Despite the breadth of its political activism, the Klan is today remembered largely as a violent vigilante group, and not without reason. Members of the Klan and affiliated organizations often carried out acts of lynching and night riding, the physical harassment of bootleggers, union activists, civil rights workers, or any others deemed immoral, such as suspected adulterers, under the cover of darkness or while wearing their hoods and robes. In fact, Klan violence was extensive enough in Oklahoma that Governor John C. Walton placed the entire state under martial law in 1923. Witnesses testifying before the military court disclosed accounts of Klan violence ranging from the flogging of clandestine brewers to the disfiguring of a prominent black Tulsan for registering African Americans to vote. In Houston, the Klan maintained an extensive system of surveillance that included tapping telephone lines and putting spies in the local post office in order to root out undesirables. A mob organized and led by Klan members in Aiken, South Carolina, lynched Bertha Lohman and her 2 brothers in 1926, but no one was ever prosecuted. The sheriff, deputies, city attorney, and state representative all belonged to the Klan. The Klan dwindled in the face of scandal and diminished energy over the last years of the 1920s. By 1930, the Klan only had about 30,000 members and was largely spent as a national force, only to appear again as a much diminished force during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. 10. Conclusion. In his inauguration speech in 1929, Herbert Hoover told Americans that the Republican Party had brought prosperity. Even ignoring the stubbornly large rates of poverty and unparalleled levels of inequality, he could not see the weaknesses behind the decade's economy. Even as the new culture of consumption promoted new freedoms, it also promoted new insecurities. An economy built on credit exposed the nation to tremendous risk. Flailing European economies, high tariffs, wealth inequality, a construction bubble, and an ever more flooded consumer market loomed dangerously until the Roaring Twenties ground to a halt. In a moment, the nation's glitz and glamour seemed to give way to decay and despair. For farmers, racial minorities, unionized workers, and other populations that did not share in the 1920s prosperity, the veneer of a jazz age and the booming economy had always been a fiction. But for them, as for millions of Americans, the end of an era was close. The Great Depression loomed. This has been Chapter 20, The New Era, from the second edition of the American Yawp, Volume 2, by the Stanford University Press. This audiobook was produced by Audileo.com, a leader in academic audiobooks.